Now I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Will Friedman. Dr. Friedman is the president of Public Agenda, a not-for-profit organisation based in New York, which aims to help leaders and citizens navigate divisive, complex issues and work together on solutions. His areas of expertise include public opinion research, public and stakeholder engagement, deliberative democracy, political science, political psychology, convening design, facilitation, training, and non-profit leadership and management. Dr. Friedman joined Public Agenda in 1994, and in 2011 he became the president of Public Agenda. He is the author of numerous publications and co-editor of the book Toward Wiser Public Judgment, published in 2011. Dr. Friedman holds a PhD in political science with specializations in political psychology and American politics from the City University of New York. We're delighted that Dr. Friedman has been able to travel to South Australia to share his expertise with us. He's here today to talk about the principles behind good design. Please join me in welcoming him to the stage. Dr. Will Friedman.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. Well, it's wonderful to be in Australia and to be in Adelaide and to be sharing with you and learning about the really exciting, robust, bold public engagement work that you guys are doing. It's an experiment in deliberative democracy and public engagement that I am very interested in following as somebody who's been working in this field for about 25 years. And I know other people in my network in the States are very interested as well. I mean, it's ambitious, it's exciting, and it's a pleasure to be here to learn with you about this stuff, understand what you guys are doing, and to share what I'm doing in the hopes that it adds some value and is relevant. So I want to talk about the issues of design as I've experienced them. I've been doing this kind of work for quite a while. Our organization was founded 40 years ago. So the organization has been devoted to trying to understand how the public grapples with issues and how to create the conditions that allows the public to grapple with issues more effectively for a long time. And design, in terms of the way I think of it at least, has a lot to do with figuring out how do you create the conditions that allow the public to do its work. Critically important in terms of the kind of crisis that we're starting to veer into in our democracies. Certainly in the States, government has never been held in such low regard. The trust has plummeted. Our Congress is in the single digits now as far as people trusting that they're going to do the right thing for the country. Never been that low in my lifetime. So something is amiss, and I know that issues of trust are in government and the sense of disconnect between leaders and their constituents and citizens. That's a worldwide phenomenon to some extent. I don't think it's quite at the level it is here. I don't think it's quite the same level as it is in the States. But I know that those issues persist here, and I admire the way you guys are reaching for ways to connect up the citizenry and the leadership to solve problems. And I think really to think about this work from a problem-solving point of view is the most useful starting point. There are problems that persist, that we're not making progress on, that we're dancing around, that are too important to allow them to fester. And as a result, there's a sense of a legitimacy crisis and a sense of people, not quite knowing what to do. Many people here are practitioners, and I think we're on different levels of sophistication or hands-on experience with this work. So I'm going to try to, pitch it in a way that's relevant to folks with different levels as best as I can, but I hope you bear with me. If sometimes it's a little bit simple, and sometimes, maybe it's a little complex, you can try to slow me down. But let's take a look at the issues of design, at least as I've experienced them, and talk them through a little bit, and see what tends to be helpful, what tends to get in the way. This is very easy. It says next. I can do that. So just so we're on the same page here, just the simplest way to talk about it is we're talking about efforts to involve the community and involve the citizenry in meaningful public problem solving. That can be public policy, and so one of the ways you see this work play out is around input on public policy, but I would encourage people to think broader than that public problem solving goes beyond public policy by the government. It also is helpful to think about it as ways in which government, NGOs, citizens can all play their part in addressing difficult challenges that we face as a society. And in fact, when we talk about issues of design, I'm kind of getting, I'm anticipating a slide down the road. How you frame the issue makes a big difference. And if you frame the issue as something like, tell government how we can help you, tell us how to, give us a little input on our policy, that's one dynamic. Another dynamic is how can we do a better job of working together, and what's the role that all of us need to play, right? That's a different dynamic in addressing some challenge. And that makes a difference to the conversation you have and what you elicit, what you bring out in people. So just broadly speaking, I like to say we're looking at public problem solving, not just at policy. Policy is part of that picture. Many of you are familiar with this sort of spectrum from IEP2. So it's just to say there are different kinds of levels of intensity and levels of partnership in this work. Sometimes you're informing, sometimes you just want to get some input and consult, sometimes you want to partner and involve and collaborate, sometimes you're even giving the power over and allowing the community to actually make the decision in some sense. That's the scariest part for leaders, is to get into that side of things. If you don't have some anxiety when you get into that as a public official, you're not really present and thinking this through. It's natural. And down the other end is less anxiety provoking. So I like to raise the anxiety a little bit, but not freak people out, and help them kind of figure out how to manage these more ambitious kinds of engagements. But anyway, just so, many of you have probably seen that. How many people have seen the spectrum? Right. Okay. Just so we're on the same page, I agree. There's different kinds of intensity, different kinds of levels of power and control and collaboration, et cetera. So, challenges. There's lots of challenges to doing this well, and I'm a pragmatic type, and I would say that if you want to think about issues of design, it's helpful to think about it in relationship to overcoming the challenges to doing this work effectively, right? So let's just take a minute to just to get our heads into the game a little bit, to think about the challenges of doing public engagement well, and doing it effectively and doing it with impact. So I want you to just take a moment to actually just think and actually talk about that at your tables, just for 2 minutes. Cluster in little groups of 2 and 3, and I want you to think about what are the, if you're fairly inexperienced in this work, you can think about what do you anticipate as the biggest challenges to doing it well. If you're fairly sort of experienced and you've done a lot, think about what are the cutting edge challenges for this field. And I just want you to kind of get people get their heads into the game a little bit. I'm going to give you 2 minutes to cluster in 2s or 3s and just talk about what do you think some of those challenges might be. I'll hear some examples, and then we'll go on, and we'll see if design is relevant to meeting those challenges. So have at it. Let's bring it back, and I'd like to hear just a few examples of some of the, obviously, you guys could talk for another 20 minutes, but then I wouldn't have time to say anything, and they might get mad at me for bringing me all this way out here, and I don't say anything. So I'm going to cut into it. Let me just hear a couple of examples. What are some of the challenges of doing this work effectively that we want to try to deal with through design? We have some roving mics. Anybody want to volunteer? Over here, please, in the middle table.
Getting people interested and in the room.
Right. recruiting folks, getting beyond the usual suspects is one of the ways we talk about it. I mean, there are some folks that you know they're coming, right? Because they love to come. But there are a lot of folks that you really have to go to special lengths to get them involved.
Okay, I speak for only one half of the table because we broke into two lots of three, but essentially agree with that. Community apathy. We've always got some advocates there that are strongly engaged with the issue, but the broader community is sometimes hard to get engaged with this. But more importantly, institutional apathy. So up at the senior levels of organisations, the importance of engagement. Mm-hmm. Often the pressures on them to deliver in a very narrow level of accountability rather than a broader one is overwhelming for them.
Right. And then so it gets to be a matter of thinking about what's behind those dynamics, right? So what's behind community apathy? Sometimes it's more of a matter of mistrust than not caring. Like, is this really going to be worthwhile? Are they really going to listen to me? Things like that. It may not be, but it's, you want to understand what's behind it. In terms of the institutions, sometimes it's as much about, I mean, there could be a bunch of things, right? But sometimes it's like, don't really know how to do it well. And that's one of the reasons, that's one of the resistances. There could be a whole slew of others, but understanding what's behind those dynamics can help you figure out how to engage people more effectively. Absolutely. One more. Okay, you figure it out. You had a couple hands up. I'm not taking responsibility for that decision.
The right type of engagement, being honest about it, the appropriate engagement, the appropriate problem, mm-hmm. and what you're engaging on, being right. honest about that. So not pretend engagement, just doing it because you have to be seen to be doing it.
So there's a whole bunch of issues packed in there. I think you hit a few things that are really important things. Being genuine and authentic about it, not just checking a box, but actually doing it with sincerity. Selecting issues skillfully. Selecting issues, I'll talk about that briefly. I don't have time to go into it in depth, but there's a whole thing about issues that are ripe for engagement from the public's point of view. Framing them effectively, so you frame them in a way that people can access them. All of those things are challenges and critically important and can subvert your effort. Let me, thank you. So that's just to kind of get us going. Let me give you an example of a sort of a challenging situation from early in my career. I was asked by state government, the State Board of Education of Nebraska. How many people have heard of Nebraska in Australia? Okay, yeah. So Nebraska's in the middle of the country. In the states, education policy is very decentralized. There's not a national education policy to speak of. There's little bits and pieces of it, but mostly each state figures it out for themselves. So fairly early in my career, there was a movement for each of the states to create statewide standards. And not only, I mean, education is decentralized not just at the state level, but at the district level, at the very local level. That's where there's a lot of control over policy. And there was a movement to have statewide educational standards, which are basically educational goals for each grade level, to ensure that all students in all the different schools are kind of on the same page and are coming out with similar kinds of education, that sort of idea. The state board, in this case, and just to make it more complicated, in every state, the board is selected in different ways. Sometimes they're appointed by the governor, sometimes they're elected regionally. In this case, the state board is elected regionally. They were trying to decide whether to create statewide academic standards. They were split 6-6. They happened to have an even number just so things would get more, would not work out oftentimes. So they were split on it, and they were trying to figure out how to get unsplit and make a decision, because all the other states were creating statewide standards, and their governor wanted to create statewide standards, and the Board of Education was trying to decide if they were going to go along with it, the State Board of Education. So they did something which I admired. The impulse was, well, let's go to the public and hear from people and get some input and see if that helps us decide. So they did their own kind of poorly designed attempt, but well-intentioned, poorly designed attempt to engage the public. And what they did was they created this listening tour, and they went around to the different regions where they were elected from, and they had these sessions where people could talk to them about how they felt about whether there ought to be statewide standards. This effort was, as I said, I think it was, good impulse, but it was undermined by this group of 30, 40 activists who were against state standards. They were local control activists. And they would travel to every place there was a public hearing and dominate the proceedings, right? So they couldn't really get, this broad-based input that they were trying to get and kind of get a read for how the public was looking at this issue to help them decide which way they would go and if they were going to go a particular way, how to go in that direction, that sort of thing. So that was the situation, right? My job and my organization's job was to kind of come up with a strategy and a design that would help to allow them to kind of navigate that dynamic that they were stuck in and get a fuller public engagement kind of a read on things and hopefully develop some public support and public will for the direction they would end up going in the end. I'm going to leave it there and come back to the story as we move through the presentation, but that's just to say that's the kind of assignment one gets, right? Our job is to come in oftentimes when, we want to be proactive. We want to be proactive and as much as possible and be engaging people early and often and all of that. But oftentimes we're coming in when things are sort of getting stuck and there are challenges, and so we want to deal with them. So design helps us overcome these challenges. Poor design makes them worse. Good design minimizes or helps us navigate through them. Let me just get past the poor design concept quickly because I don't want that to stick in your head. I want to talk about what's tended to work in my experience and my understanding of things. What's interesting is that in the States, at least, and you can let me know later if this is true here, but the three most common ways in which public officials tend to engage the public are all prime examples of poor design. So first is the public hearing, where you kind of have some officials up on a stage and you have people, big group of people, and they come up to the microphone and they have their say, right? So it's basically, how to design a gripe session. That's what you get. You get the people who are the bravest, who are the angriest, they're the bravest, and they're willing to come up to the microphone, and you haven't done anything to help to stimulate them to think through their views. They're just coming in with their deeply held views, and they like to sound off, and you get what you set up. You get people. So as one school leader told me, I'm talking to him about public engagement. He says, my experience is much more public arrangement. I'm not sure I really buy what you're saying. The other typical approach is the expert panel. Now, we're throwing that at you today, but I hope, this is a conference, this is a meeting of folks that are interested in this topic and are practitioners, and it makes sense in this context. Doing it with the general public, it basically turns out to be a way to kind of bore people to sleep while also giving a shot at their self-esteem. Because they're just not, just inundating them with a lot of research and expert information does not do a thing for them typically. The impulse is good. We want to inform people. We're trying to inform democracy, trying to inform citizens. That's good. That's a good impulse. But to simply dump a lot of data and information and a lot of expert talk at folks, at the general public, it doesn't really work. It bounces off people. It makes, and to the extent there is any conversation that follows, you've given all the advantages to the more educated expert folks in the room, and everybody else kind of fades away. The third way that's typical is to set up a pro-con debate where you have people from two extremes, and for some reason you put them on TV and you have them, they're from different, parties, and you have them argue the position out as if there's, two extreme positions for every question, and they're predictable, and you kind of know what people are going to say before they say it, and it's just another excuse to kind of encourage people not to think about the issue in any more complex way. So those are the things we typically see. None of them really help people think. None of them really change the conversation that's been going around and not getting anywhere. None of them stimulate collaborative problem solving particularly well. And let's assume there may be better ways, and I know that's what you guys are about. So let's move on and think about what are some of the elements of good design. So first is thinking about one's, what I want to share with you are principles and questions that can help you think about good designs. I don't have a recipe for you. I don't have a, you're going to hear about some methods and so forth, but I don't have like any kind of a recipe, or it's more like what are the things you need to be thinking about in order to design something that fits the situation. And first of all, think about your goals. What are you really trying to achieve? Are you trying to get input into a new policy? Are you trying to stimulate public participation in a solution and get the community activated to collaborate with government or to solve the problem on their own? There are so many issues that government can't solve by itself, and that requires, different sorts of people and agents and entities working together. All of the sort of, what in the literature they call the wicked problems that aren't technical issues. There's no top-down technical solution to them. And they're almost, and they can't be completely solved, but they can be better addressed and better navigated. Closing achievement gaps, for example, in our schools, that's been resistant to any easy fix for decades now, and is going to require all sorts of people working together. Then you can't just mandate something. You need to collaborate with parents. You need to collaborate with community-based organizations. You need to get schools kind of working together in new ways. And there are all sorts of decisions that are questions of human values. They're just not a technical fix. So public participation in a solution, greater understanding and tolerance around social tensions, just a fresher, more productive conversation. There's all kinds of goals that you might have. You might have primary and secondary goals. Beginning with the end in mind, I would say, is principle number one. Will set you on the path. Second is begin by listening. It's good to take time early on to really understand the public's starting point and the starting point of different sub-publics as you start thinking about how can you engage people. It'll allow you to be more effective. It'll help you to understand how they're framing the issue, right? Not just how you frame it, but how do they talk about it? How do they think about it? What's their sort of initial opinion? Think about the difference in some issue where people haven't even decided it's a problem, right? And what that means for engagement versus a situation where people are really anxious about it. Totally different dynamics, right? And it calls on you to do different things as you reach out to them. Does that make sense? This also is part of understanding how do you select issues that are ripe for engagement, right? Listening to the community really, and you can do this through all sorts of, formal and informal ways. You can do it through research. You can do it through just getting out and talking to folks. But the whole question of, sometimes you're sort of forced to do an issue because your boss said you have to or something like that. But you often have some leeway in terms of selecting the issues. Government has a limited capacity. You can't engage everything. The public has a limited capacity. They can't engage everything. People have lives. So it's wise to be selective about the issues that you're going to really do, especially ambitious sorts of public engagement. You conserve your energy and you use it for the things that are most important. So issues that tend to be ripe for engagement, in my experience, are ones that the public does care about, or they're like really ready to care about. Like with one little tidbit of information, it sets it off, right? So there's energy from their side. We talked about apathy, right? So if you're picking an issue that's way down on their list and they just don't see it, it's going to be harder. If it's something that they're exercised about, there's a sense of urgency about, that helps. It's also best if it's not a narrow technical issue, right? You want to be dealing with the public. You want to be dealing with broader questions, values questions, questions of sort of general direction, not with super technical, narrow questions that are really the domain of experts. The public can help you set direction, can help you talk about the kind of community you want to have, can talk about all sorts of things. But if you don't ask a question that's conducive to their responding, that somehow is geared more towards some kind of narrow technical expert type of a thing, it's boring and it doesn't work very well. It's not very exciting, and you just haven't selected quite the right topic. And that is actionable. I mean, why bother people if it's not actionable is another important thing. And my preference is that it's actionable on many dimensions, on many levels, right? My preference when I'm selecting, when I have my druthers, when I have my choice, I prefer that it be actionable not just by a policy response, but also there are things that community-based organizations and NGOs can do, and there are things that individual citizens can do as well to respond. And that's the public problem-solving frame. Because if you do that, you can almost always get a bit of a win. It's never a situation where, okay, somehow the policy, I mean, I did this huge public engagement campaign in New Jersey once about tax reform, and it was all going swimmingly, and we had people from, we did this summit in the capital of the state. We had people from every region of the state, and it was great. And then there was a sex scandal in the governor's office, and the whole thing kind of got lost, and there was no way to act on it in any other way, and that's too bad. I mean, it might have been good for the governor, I don't know, but it didn't help the engagement process. Actionable in many ways, that allows you to try to make progress on the issue on lots of different levels. And you may not get the big policy like Eureka kind of a thing, but you may get other kinds of ways to move the ball down the field and make some progress. Those, I think, are good issues. And then there's a question of how you frame those issues. So a few attributes of framing. Not too narrow, not too broad. Kind of right-size it. You want to frame the problem in a way that's big enough to make a difference, but small enough to kind of make progress. I've seen many, many examples of really ambitious public engagement. And this kind of goes back to the 5-minute kind of thing in the deliberative question. Many, many examples of very ambitious engagement where they just ask these humongous questions and don't give people any time, and you just get mush, right? Well, you just get abstraction. You don't get anything that you can really, do anything with, because you've asked them to solve world hunger in 25 minutes, and it just can't be done, but it's kind of going through the motions. And so figuring out sort of the right cut into the issue is part of the... Oh, sorry, okay. Yeah, I confused myself, okay. Making it, so part of the art is making this stuff accessible without oversimplifying it too much. All of that takes work, right? I'm a big believer in testing materials before you go public with them. So, get little focus groups together and provide materials and see if it works and see if people understand them and if it stimulates what you're trying to stimulate. And then I want to encourage people to think in terms of framing issues, not for persuasion, but for deliberation. So it's the idea of kind of coming with questions, not with answers, right? Because that's what gets people into this problem-solving mode. So one of the ways that we do that in my organization is through a technique that we call choice work, which lays out, you can't really see it, but I'm just trying to graphically give you the feeling. It basically gives people a little bit of background information on the problem and then lays out alternative scenarios for solutions, each of which is kind of fairly laid out in a nonpartisan manner, with pros and cons and trade-offs, detailed, in kind of simple, concrete terms that people can understand. This one happens to be about immigration policy. So the first approach is dramatically strengthen the enforcement of current laws and reduce the level of legal immigration. The second is to match immigration policy to the needs of the economy specifically. So let's bring in immigrants that can help the economy. The third is reform the system to take advantage of the enormous social and economic contributions of immigrants, and it's the most sort of wide open and welcoming kind of approach. And it lays out more about, well, what are the actions that flow from that point of view? What are some of the pros and cons arguments you hear about that point of view? And the trade-offs that people need to deal with. Because part of this work is really about helping people get grounded in reality and get past wishful thinking. Lord knows people have been pandered to by leaders so much in their life that you can't really blame them for wanting to find an easy answer, because people are always telling them there is a magic bullet, or they're always telling them, if only we could get rid of this person over here, everything would be easy. And part of this work is really helping people realize that there aren't easy answers. There are tough decisions to be made, and that we need to sort of be realistic about things. And whatever path we go down, there's going to be challenges, so that they don't just run away as soon as things get hard. So that's, this has been quite useful to us on kind of framing things in terms of alternative choices. The idea isn't to say that, you have to, oftentimes they'll come up with a fourth idea that combines certain elements or has some new things that they brought up and things like that. It's not a matter of sort of rigidly keeping people in these boxes, but it's a way to help people kind of get going in their thinking, and get going in some dialogue, and it helps the public kind of get up to speed very quickly on things. And it doesn't, and it allows, it's a technique that allows sort of people with different levels of sophistication all to kind of enter the conversation, because this approach makes the most sense to me. Here's why, and they can kind of talk from their experience, and it's very sort of facilitation friendly too, for those of you who are facilitators. So it's just another technique. You can see lots of examples of that on our website of choice work discussion starters if you're interested. So I don't know if Uncle Sam makes sense for you guys, but anyway, we talked about getting the people in the room. So there's a lot to be thought about in terms of recruiting. I'm going to speed up because I know I'm starting to run out of time here. But recruiting with purpose. I mean, there's random sample approaches, and then there's sort of stakeholder analysis approaches, right? So the random sample makes a certain amount of sense. You can hear about a deliberative poll, which uses a random sample way of recruiting. Stakeholder analysis recruitment means that you're thinking about who's affected by the problem, who can contribute to solutions, who has tended to be marginalized or left out of this discussion historically, and figuring out ways of getting those folks to participate. And that can be very hard work. But there are a lot of tricks to doing that, and if you put in the time, you can get beyond the usual suspects and kind of get a very interesting mix of folks with different points of view and different ways of contributing. So again, it kind of depends on your purpose, what you're trying to achieve. And then creating opportunities for folks with diverse points of view to interact. There's research in this field that shows that if you put a bunch of people who have a similar point of view in the room and ask them to talk about things, they tend to reinforce the original position and go more to the extreme. So how you counteract that in terms of deliberative design is by having diverse folks at the table, diverse ideas on the table, and then people start bouncing off things, and that subverts that tendency of polarizing. And it allows people to kind of learn and kind of soften the hard edges of their view and kind of learn from other people and develop a sort of more sense of common ground. So in Nebraska, we basically, instead of having a situation where we had these official hearing sessions, we asked local communities to organize their own community conversations. So, and we train local facilitators to organize and moderate them. And we provided technical assistance and so forth, but it wasn't this sort of this very official kind of way of the board members going out and being on a stage and hearing from folks. It was these community-based, community organized conversations. And we helped them kind of execute it and built their capacity to do so. And it allowed us to kind of fly a little bit below the radar of the activists, because they were community-based activities. In one case, they found us. But because of the design and the way we broke people up into small, moderated groups, we were able to kind of diffuse and kind of manage it, even though they found us. So basically, the design allowed us to kind of navigate through with a few hairy moments. We kind of navigated through, and we're able to essentially get a pretty full read. And what the public basically said in that situation, going all over the state with that design, was that people did want to have some statewide standards. They did feel that their kids aren't going to stay on the farm. It's a very rural state. They want their kids to be able to go to any college in the country, so they didn't want to just, they didn't want to have some kind of a different education in their town. They wanted their kids to have the same opportunities as any kids, even way back in the big city in the eastern part of the state. Even though they were a fairly stable, a rural community, they would move. They didn't want to move to a different school district and have a completely, confusing situation because their kid was all of a sudden thrown into a class that was learning something totally different, that sort of things. On the other hand, they wanted to have local control. They didn't want state standards to inhibit their ability to teach about their very local culture. So they get that feedback. They didn't want state standards to mean that the state was going to cut money to the arts or other things. So there were some provisions in there. But what it did basically was allowed us to get a really full read of the public and share that with the state boards. Sometimes they came and observed, but they didn't participate. They just observed. Sometimes it's hard for them to keep their mouths shut because they're used to being at the center of the stage. And allowed them to resolve, and they made their decision, and they developed their own state standards and their own version of that. So that's how we navigated that. So just very quickly, I'm going to jump ahead and just several questions that I think are useful in design. I'm rushing a little bit because I'm going over time, but what are our primary and secondary goals? Think about the end. Who should participate? How will we include them? Err towards inclusiveness is my policy. How do we make this reflective? It's really easy to kind of get input, get people's comments, that kind of a thing. But thinking about how do we help people think, right? What information, what tools really will help people think about this without inundating them with so much information that they're helpless. But just providing enough that it helps them reflect, helps them think, and how will they interact with each other or with public officials. The action question, how will the process impact policy and other kinds of problem solving? Again, trying to get you off of just thinking about policy. And then let's make it exciting, let's make it fun. There's nothing wrong with having a little fun. I'm going to end on that note. Thank you very much.